Okay, my aim today is to take you on a tour of the theme of division and separation in sepulchral epigram. As we'll see, there are two main lines of development of this theme. I'm going to begin with the oldest. Before there were sepulchral epigrams, there were sepulchres, such as the ones marked by the uninscribed semata we see in the Iliad. These markers were erected primarily to separate the living from the dead. Only secondarily did they gain a memorial function. It is at this time that it becomes useful for a grave to bear an inscription naming the deceased. Then a passerby would not require the intervention of a local interpreter if he wished to discover the person buried there. Many of the earliest epigrams do little more than reveal this name. But this memorial function has already begun to bridge the boundary of death. A marker that had begun as a way to warn people away from a space became a marker that intended to attract them to a space and connect them to a person on the other side of death's boundary. A few epigrams attempt to justify this reconciliation. Consider, for example, passage 1. The first line reframes death not as something that divides, but as something that unites. It is common to every human. The final line, however, admits that the dividing function is still operative. Its two clauses, which separate neatly at the caesura, first, dismiss the reader to go their way, bidding them farewell and admitting that they are still on the move, and then the second shows how the dead are the opposite. They must stay in place, the stone will keep them where they are. Death, then, remains a boundary, but it is paradoxically a boundary that is open to all. Burial in a foreign land was irresistible as an epigrammatic theme. Separation in space reinforced and accentuated the separation of death. Passage 2, for instance, probably an early specimen, was inspired by the thought of a rather famous community of Greeks marooned in Persia, presumably nostalgic for their homeland. Passage 3 is an interesting example of the power of spatial separation. As Gow and Page point out in their commentary, it's quite clear here that the separation is exaggerated, since Hermione is part of the Argolid. What is more, the epigram in its second couplet admits as much, because although the man was buried among foreigners, his entire family was present for the burial. The irony here is poignant. Hegesippus introduces the idea of distance to reinforce the separation of death, but then by minimizing that distance, provokes the realization that death constitutes a great gulf, even when the burial is not itself far off. The separation of death could be made even more pronounced by introducing the sea. In a sense, this is an extension of spatial separation in general. The sea introduces a barrier that is more difficult to overcome than mere distance. But as passages 4 and 5 show, death at sea introduces another separation. It splits the name from the body. Passage 4 represents the rarer case in which a body is found and buried on the shore. Its name is unknown, and this fact is implicitly connected to the dead man's inability to interact properly with his burier or even with the reader. Without a name and a connection to a homeland, he cannot say the things that he acknowledges need to be said. Passage 5, then, is the more usual case, where a sailor has been lost at sea. The concept of distance is introduced in the third line. In a sense, the distance to Sopolus's body is infinite, because it cannot be located. It is only somewhere on the brine. But more striking is the fourth line, where Callimachus points out that the absence of the body makes the tomb empty, bearing only a name. The most obvious way to bridge this gap is simply to reunite the name and body. Or so it would seem. Some epigrams try this. See passage 6, for instance. In my opinion, most modern readers are insufficiently surprised by this epigram, which gives the drowned man a name, without any explanation as to how that name came to be known. It is worth noting, though, that at the same time as the barrier of namelessness is overcome, the sea and land are coming very close together. Too close for Nicetes' comfort, in fact. Other epigrams give more detailed, if not necessarily more convincing, narratives to bring sea and land burial closer together. First, as can be seen in passage 6 itself, death at sea is not per se incompatible with burial on land, as long as one is not too picky about the precise place where the body is buried or about how close it is to the sea. A shipwreck victim buried on the shore has received, serially, burial in both water and in earth. He also receives a parallel burial in both, as a seaside burial may be considered liminal, neither fully land nor sea. But at the same time, the nearness of the sea is threatening. Passage 7 implies a repeated process of burial on land, followed by excavation of the mound by the sea, recapturing the body. In the end, the deceased speaker gives up on burial at all. Bianor surely deserves the award for the most clever variation on this theme. In Passage 8, everything is reversed. Cleitonomus, whose very name insists that he deserves to be remembered, is supposed to be buried in water, but this time the land encroaches on the water, claiming his body, keeping it safe from any dampness. The border between land and water is further obscured by the fact that the man is called a hormos, or harbor. This harbor is then preserved by being kept on dry land. Of course, burial is not the only difficulty for a body lost at sea. The problem of namelessness, for instance, can only realistically be overcome if a connection is made between the body and its homeland. Solutions to this problem are found even among the early Hellenistic epigrammatists. I have not included these on my handouts, but Posidippus writes an epigram that includes a prayer that the drifting body may be cast ashore on the shore of his homeland, and Leonidas gives us one in which this actually happens. Hegesippus gives us a shipwrecked corpse cremated in a foreign land, but then returned to home in an urn. These, however, are only the most obvious ways to reconcile land and sea. Some epigrammatists attempt even more complex interchange between water and land. Bianor, for instance, steps in again with Passage 9. A coffin on land washes out in a river, and then a boy, the son of the couple in the coffin, reclaims it for the land, but then is himself done in by the river. Antipholus manages almost precisely the opposite in Passage 10, a piece that emphasizes the ironic interchange so insistently that it seems more lesson than poem. Antipholus was quite enamored of this theme. He explores it again in Passage 11, this time without any sepulchral attachments. Antipholus uses the unusual octopus and hare scene to connect land and sea, the last couplet joining them as tightly as the octopus wrapped the hare. Not only do the two animals end up as a single ball of twisted feet, but both also begin by skulking in hiding places, with the octopus particularly marked as being in a liminal space. In fact, though the Greek can probably admit of other meanings, it seems clear to me that the first two words of the poem indicate that the octopus was found in a tidal pool, an ideal interface between land and sea. There is a small series of epigrams, a variant on poems like Passage 9, that dispense with corpses altogether and deal with ships, in dry dock for construction or repair, that are washed out to sea or burned, emphasizing the irony of either fate. The point is probably brought out best by a late imitator in Passage 12. Ships are the perfect vehicle, if you'll permit the expression, for bringing together sea and land. Constructed in one domain, they are fit for the other, and when they are in dry dock, one may question whether they are in or out of their native element. The key innovation in this epigram lies in the role that the water plays, as outlined in the last line. While a ship normally repels water, here it invites water. Visually, the water is being invited to crash down over the ship in precisely the form that a sailor would ordinarily fear, and for the purpose of saving, rather than sinking, the ship. Let us return to the shipwrecked corpse in early Hellenistic epigram. It was possible to put more obstacles in the way of a bridge between sea and land. A body could not be buried on land if there was no body to be found, and it was entirely possible that a drowned man would be eaten by fish. Despite the difficulty, though, we have as many epigrams that attempt to resolve this divide as we have that invoke it straightforwardly. The first is a fairly famous example by Leonidas, Passage 13. As you can see from the beginning, the epigram puts itself forward as a means to join the divided land and sea. And at first there seems some hope that all might go well. After all, there's no shipwreck here. The ship is fine, and it will be ready to return safely home as soon as the anchor is freed. The speaker dives into the water, which might imply the same kind of marriage of land and sea that is represented by the idea of a ship itself. But on the other hand, and this is the possibility that manifests itself, the association of lines, a hook-like anchor, and submerging in water must also produce thoughts of fishing in the ancient reader, as in Passage 16, and in that scenario, the speaker here is taking on the role of the live bait. Thus, the sepulchral reconciliation of land and sea that is promised in the first line is delivered only at the cost of a much more shocking division, that of the body itself. It is not buried in a single place that may be regarded as land and sea. Rather, it is buried in two places, part in land and part in sea, neither satisfactory. A more realistic version of this scenario may be seen in passage 14, and it begins with a more realistic appraisal of the result. No place can claim all of the deceased, and his body's division into halves happens not at the navel, but much more subtly. Exchanging the separation of land and sea for a separation of the body itself, however, can scarcely be regarded as a solution, and passage 15 attempts to move farther. As in passage 14, we have a contrast between half and whole. The man is half devoured by fish, but this does not prevent a complete burial because the fish are buried alongside him. This is the best bridge one could hope for in the circumstances. I must give at least a moment to the most bizarre development in this line. As you can see from the previous passages, the division between land and sea, which gives way to a division of the body itself, is paving the way for an opposition of man and fish. Resolving this opposition, which has led in the previous passages to dramatic episodes in which men died when bitten by fish, inevitably leads to the idea of men biting back. Of course, men bite fish all the time. That is the point of catching them, after all. So Leonidas, in passage 16, must become creative to make the point. He introduces the hapless Tharsis, who hooks a fish that is not quite like his usual catch. In fact, it is a Ulysses, a fish that is called deadly in the poem because it was thought to have a poisonous bite. Leonidas thus links immediately to earlier fish bites man poems. The reader expects that Tharsis has met his fate in this fish. However, no sooner is the fish named than we see not it biting Tharsis, but Tharsis biting it. This behavior is unexplained in the poem, and previous commentators have thought that this was done to kill the fish. From my admittedly little experience fishing, this seems quite unlikely to me. I think it more likely that Tharsis was boldly trying to extract the hook from the fish, something for which we use pliers today, but I suppose the teeth might work in a pinch, as long as you don't fear a sharp or poisonous bite. Even here, though, with Tharsis mouth-to-mouth with a fish, Leonidas delivers the unexpected. The biting becomes swallowing as the fish leaps down Tharsis's throat. I include in my handout a picture of a rainbow wrasse from Thompson's Glossary of Greek Fishes, so you could experience the same wincing sensation that an ancient reader would feel at this point. While this is, in fact, a very pretty fish with lovely colors, and it tends, like most wrasses, to keep its fins quite close to its body most of the time, it does possess quite pronounced bony dorsal and anal fins, and in a panicked slide down Tharsis's throat, it would inevitably have extended them. Man and fish come together in this poem in startling ways. They have exchanged biting habits, and the man, as he flops around amidst his fishing gear, clearly behaves as a dying fish would do. His catch has become his bait, and his fish's fins have hooked him. At this point, as we've begun to see the body of the deceased split, it is worthwhile to turn back to the inscribed origins of epigram. The idea of a split in the self of some kind is found already there. Passage 17, for instance, is one of many 4th century epigrams that characterizes death as a separation between the soma and the psyche. In these epigrams, the body lies in the ground, while the soul goes either into the aether or into the underworld. This way of speaking about death was remarkably resilient. Passage 18 is more than 1,000 years later, part of a longish quasi-epigram on Lazarus. Plato is responsible for a different way of conceiving death. As we can see in passage 19, for him, the soul does not go into the air or into Hades. In fact, despite the fact that the Phaedo was known anciently as on the soul, it is not even the soul at all from which the body separates. Rather, it is the being himself who survives. Of course, as Socrates had implied earlier in the dialogue, this self that survives is contained in his logos, which we conceive as some vehicle for the person's reasoning, his argument, or perhaps the dialectic method itself. In a way, Plato's conception here is only slightly different. Although he dispenses with the word soul, he is still thinking of death as a separation, and thus well within established tradition. His innovation is to think that no harm was done. The essential person has simply survived. For him, separation is not a key idea. We might expect Plato's divergent idea to have an effect on the tradition after him. In fact, however, the signs are muddled. For instance, passage 20, a quite plain epigram, which seems early to my judgment, attributes eternal life to Plato's soul, but it does not attribute eternal life to the man himself. Rather, it is thoroughly conventional, along the lines of passage 17, and if anything, less creative. To find one that adopts Plato's terms thoroughly, we must go all the way to Diogenes Laertius. AP 7:129, not on your handout, allows the man himself to survive while the body perishes. The connection to Plato is not acknowledged here, though. The poem is addressed to Zeno. And none of the poems recognize the importance of the logos to Plato's formulation of life continuing after the end of the body. I must confess at this point that I had overlooked the Agathias poem AP 11:354, which Joseph Romero mentioned in his paper, his number 15. I'm not entirely sure what to make of the last couplet, but it certainly does speak in terms of the survival of the self rather than the souls, fully picking up Plato's point. Coexisting within the inscribed tradition of a separation between body and soul at death is a tradition of the dead person leaving behind a memory of himself. I confess this does not seem at first to be a parallel case. The memory of a dead person does not seem to be a part of the self in the same way that the soul does. But I think it is worth including here for two reasons. The first reason is that the survival of memory is sometimes mentioned in the same terms as the survival of the soul. Passage 21, for instance, is quite similar to passage 20. The second reason is that, in fact, this persistence of memory, conceptually, is much more similar to Plato's conception of the persistence of the person through his logos. In fact, sepulchral epigrams about poets represent the best epigrammatic continuation of the ideas Plato advanced in the Phaedo. Callimachus's Heraclitus epigram is surely the best known place where this happens, but others present clearer cases, such as passage 22. Of course, as we saw earlier with some of the death by fish epigrams, separation of the body into parts is itself sufficient to indicate death, even without mentioning a soul or something else less material that the body now lacks. This innovation, which I attributed to Leonidas in passage 13, also has its roots in older epigram. The passage of cremation also involved a separation. The body was divided into flesh and bone, of which the former was consumed by fire and the latter was buried. Passage 23 documents the procedure. As you can see from this passage, poems like passage 14 borrow from the cremation tradition to formulate their reply to passage 13. Additional separations could be layered onto the separation of flesh and bones, such as in passage 24, which reinforces the division between flesh and bone by giving it a spatial separation. Philip of Thessalonica, in passages 25 and 26, seems to have been interested in replying to this trend. In both poems, he divides the body up into unusual assortments of pieces, and in both he denies that anything will come of this. There is no immortality in passage 25, and no point in the body ever having been whole in passage 26. Given that the division of soul from body and the division of the body itself were both themes of inscribed epigram, we should not be surprised to see the division of the soul earlier in the development of written epigram. At first, in the well-known passage 27, this appeared in erotic contexts. But after the passage of some centuries, Christians adapted the theme for non-erotic friendships, as we see in passage 28. Later still, Agathias would be able to resolve this separation by having the two brothers who shared a soul die at the same time. Passage 27 borrows heavily from sepulchral epigram. In the first couplet, the departure of the soul is a sign of death. It has stopped breathing, and it is possible that Hades has snatched it away. While the poem becomes more purely erotic in later lines, it still leaves the reader with the impression that Callimachus is brought to death's door by his departed love. The same is the case in Gregory's example. The death of half a soul leaves the remaining brother just as bad off. Unlike the divided soul, the divided body never made a noticeable inroad into erotic epigram, despite the presence of dividing the body as a theme in erotic contexts in other ancient literature, such as the lustful parceling out of the body of reconciliation at the end of Aristophanes' Lysistrata, Aristophanes' speech in Plato's Symposium, and Narcissus' wish to be divided from himself so as to better love himself in Ovid's Metamorphoses. On the other hand, a division does come up in passage 29, a 6th century epigram with erotic implications. Here, it is what we would call a divided mind. A girl can't decide whether to have sex with the narrator or not. Notice that as soon as the idea of division comes up, the narrator begins to speak as if he is near death, wasting away. Let me sum up to this point. I followed two major threads forward from inscribed epigram. The first was the idea of the separation of the dead from the living, which took on increased prominence in the context of shipwreck, leading to increasingly complex attempts to bridge the boundary, one of which involved dividing the body. The second thread involved division in the deceased in some way. First division of soul from body, leading to a division of other things such as memory from the body, and finally to divisions of the body and soul themselves. Many of these poems were erotic, but we were never far from sepulchral elements. Although these are two different threads, they do intertwine. Shipwreck sometimes leads to division of the body as well as to separation of the dead from the living. Erotic divisions of the self often lead by implication to death. I want to move on now to a few epigrams that interact with this tradition of division, separation, and attempts to bridge gaps in unusual ways. First is passage 30. In its basic pattern, this is an epigram modeled after passage 13. The boy receives burial on both land and water because of the division of his body. The most interesting innovation here is how the poem is able to dispense with both the ship and the large fish required to make passage 13 work. Here, the surface of the water itself functions as the ship, since it supports the boy's weight over the water. It then turns and functions as the fish, severing the boy's head with its ice. Since the water in question is a river rather than a lake or sea, it also has the ability to swallow the remainder of the boy as it is carried off by the rushing current under the surface. This poem seems to demonstrate an almost comically precise setup, but as we can see, its end goal is to simplify. Without any interfering agent, the division between life and death, the division between water and land, or at least quasi-land in the sense that the surface is frozen, and the division between hot and cold, and the division within the body, all occur naturally at the same point, the water's surface. The last line of passage 30 invokes the mother of the boy. Her grief creates an opportunity for further division that passage 30 did not exploit. This can be seen in the somewhat simpler epigram that is passage 31. The mother's grief for the different deaths of two sons divides the mourner as well. Passage 32 is a particularly complex play on the theme of division in death. While this poem too is modeled after the theme of death by fishbite, it skillfully moves around the elements, beginning with water. Here there is no water at all, and it is the boundary between earth and sky that matters. We're dealing with a partridge, not a fish. The partridge, however, is pictured in much the same way a caught fish would be. It is out of its element, an exile from its lofty rocky homeland, captured in a latticework cage woven like a fishing net. But this bird is no killer whale, as we might think the creature was in passage 13. It is the vulnerable one, more parallel to the humans that find themselves the victim of carnivorous fish. The cat is the predator. When the cat bites, it is the bird's head that it gets. This is a reversal from previous epigram. The head or upper body was always the preserved element, while the lower body was taken. But in fact, it is not entirely clear who is the predator here. After all, it is the narrator who uses the verb herpassa of himself, the verb typically used of the forces of death. What is more, surely it is the division of the body, regardless of who pulled from which direction on it, that killed the bird. The poem's last couplet contains a further redirection. In a reversal of the expected blessing, the narrator wishes for the dust to lie heavy on the partridge's body. But this is no curse. Rather, it is in hope that the rest of the body may not be dragged away by the cat. This, however, puts the cat in the position of the too close sea, as seen in passage 7. The one thing that is clear from this brief survey is that not only does death imply some kind of separation, but also the reverse. Separation implies death. Plato's attempt at a modification of this link, claiming that what was essential still lives whole, did not meet with much success in epigram. The only way past death, it would seem, is to reunite what was separated. But even this often implicates itself in further separations. In order not to leave you at this utterly depressing point, I would like to end with a Christian epigram. Christians, after all, genuinely believed in a way past death. And in epigram, it was inevitable that they would conceive of that way as entailing the rejoining of body and soul. Passage 33 begins its quest for reunification by noting the unity of the Creator. Because of that unity, it is possible to rejoin the two objects of creation, the body and the soul. Lazarus, left in a divided state in passage 18, rises when that division ends.